Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Thomas Wipf. I'm the chairman of the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches, and on behalf of the joint organizers, Bread for All, and the Federation of Churches, in cooperation with NGOs and the WEF, I would like to welcome you to the 6th Open Forum. Thank you very much for your interest. Can civil society contribute to peace processes? This is our issue today. The discussion will be guided by Mr. Roger de Weck later on, not Philip de Weck, as I said wrongly. It is a great pleasure to me now to introduce to you our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Micheline Calmy-Rey, who will give an introductory speech. Please. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to speak to you about an issue that is gaining ever greater importance in Swiss peace policy. I'm talking about cooperation with civil society. The Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs is looking for ways to win maximum benefits for peace processes from the potential of civil society players. And for this reason, we've been conducting a lively exchange of views with a number of specialist civil society partners for several years. It's also important to include private sector companies in our definition of civil society because often they make a positive contribution to peace processes. My ministry has done research into the role of civil society players in Switzerland's civilian peace promotion activities, and I'd like to present to you the 7 conclusions that we have drawn. First of all, civil society participation is a fundamental human right. Effective political participation is essential for determining the will of the people because this is the basis of authority of government. The right of active political participation should therefore be promoted in peace negotiations and other related processes. In Sudan, for example, my ministry is working within the framework of its conflict transformation program on the House of Nationalities, as we call it, which is a kind of parliamentary chamber representing the ethnic communities of the whole of the south of the country. Through this House of Nationalities, we have a platform within which we can provide for constructive resolution of conflicts and sustainable solutions. Secondly, enhanced legitimacy. The involvement of interest groups gives greater public legitimacy to the negotiation of new political arrangements. If a process is viewed to be legitimate, the outcomes are more likely to be treated as such. To illustrate this point, I would like to take another example of our peace promotion activities, and I am referring to electoral observations. Elections are a means by which new political orders gain legitimacy throughout a society. For instance, Switzerland sent observers to the historic elections in South Africa in April 1994, and ever since then, Switzerland had participated in 77 other observation missions. Thirdly, ownership of peace processes of peace agreements. Broad ownership of agreements contributes greatly to the sustainability of settlements. The inclusion of the largest possible number of civil society players and groups and actors from civil society will have to be taken into account in all civilian conflict transformation programs. In Sri Lanka, for instance, we support the official peace negotiations by providing in collaboration with the German government what we call a resource network for conflict studies and transformation. One of the main aims of the network is to promote reliable and crisis-resistant peace alliances between civil society actors and to empower them to participate in relevant local political processes. Fourthly, widening the agenda. Experience suggests that a more open process tends to widen the scope of political issues to be negotiated. This offers greater opportunity to address the problems and to find approaches to solutions. Regarding the launching of new peace processes and the application of new approaches to finding solutions, I consider the inclusion of women in peace processes as one of the most pressing objectives. In our program for Colombia, we are supporting selected women's organizations and thus enabling them to bring their influence to bear and to have influence on the relevant political fora. I can assure you that I will continue to attach the highest degree of importance to women representatives of civil society in the future, because I'm convinced that up to now their potential has not been utilized adequately. Thank you very much for this round of applause, and thank you. Fifthly, whoops. I haven't finished yet. I've come to fifthly, coordination of initiatives. The strategic coordination of peace initiatives through a process of civil society participation can enable more effective communication between actors and reduced duplication of initiatives, thus committing people to a common process. And let me address the example of the Geneva Initiative, which is supported by my ministry. The Geneva Initiative is an attempt at finding wider support in civil society for the peace process in the Near East. And the aim here is also to harness the enormous potential strength of the peace-supporting elements within the two societies and to set it to work for the benefit of constructive conflict resolution. Peace processes which enjoy broad-based support will have lasting results. This is why the Geneva Initiative can make a positive contribution to peace in the Middle East. You know, making peace is not a simple business. If you want to attain peace, you need to work through your feeling and anxieties. You need to be ready to enter into compromise, and the Geneva Initiative allows to break taboos, for instance, the status of Jerusalem or the right of refugees to return. That is why dialogue has to be with civil society at large, and it has to be widened. And that is why support by the international community needs to be ensured. Sixth, reconciliation. Through a process of active discussion and negotiation on disputed issues, peace talks can help to forge more cooperative relationships between countries' diverse communities and help lay the foundations for social and political reconciliation. Many of the societies where Switzerland is involved in conflict transformation processes have been affected or even indeed traumatized by earlier conflicts, and I was made very forcefully aware of this during my visit to the Balkans last year. In discussions with Bosnian women, it became clear to me that lasting peace can be achieved only if societies, if crimes such as the ones in Srebrenica can be overcome. Seventh, civil society actors as facilitators in peace processes. Experience shows that civil society groups have specific access to combatant groups, which can lead to faster and more reliable dispute resolution, especially in conflicts where the parties concerned are not interested in international intervention. It is difficult for an outside state, a non-involved state, to be involved in the peace process, and in such cases we confine our activities to supporting strategically well-positioned NGOs both within and outside the conflict zone. One point is very clear to me. Civil society can make important contributions to bringing about peace. Today, peace promotion is no longer the sole preserve of governments. It can only be done in cooperation with other players, in particular with actors in civil society. Many peace processes illustrate this point very clearly, and I am referring to our activities in Sudan, Sri Lanka, Colombia, the Middle East, or the Balkans. All these initiatives embody the principles of democracy and the right of civil society to participate in peace processes, of enhancing legitimacy and local ownership of peace agreements, of widening the agenda and coordinating initiatives, of reconciliation and achieving specific results. They also demonstrate that the multi-stakeholder process of partnership and dialogue can make very valuable contributions, in particular when it comes to creating a peaceful environment or to negotiating sustainable peace settlements. And finally, state and civil actors pursue the same goal, i.e., creating a peaceful and more stable world in which conflicts are settled through peaceful means. I am convinced that constructive cooperation between all players involved is key, is essential. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much, Federal Councillor of Foreign Affairs of the Swiss Confederation. Your applause, I think, shows how welcome you were. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to moderate this discussion in reference to what the previous speaker was saying, and undoubtedly this will come up again in the conversation. We have a wonderful meeting ahead of us. Let me begin, a wonderful panel. Idriss Shamil, to start, has multi-ethnic roots, but is from the United States, and for many years was the chief operating officer for the NGO known as Search for Common Ground in the United States. Could I ask you precisely, just to tell us in a few words, what your NGO does?
I apologize for speaking in English. I can't speak in German, and if I spoke to you in my French, I'd probably offend most of you. So my organization, which is both European and American, we have headquarters in Washington and in Brussels, has the goal of shifting the way the world deals with conflict away from adversarial win-lose approaches towards collaborative problem-solving approaches. And what that looks like, very briefly, is long-term engagements in conflict situations, to work with local partners, to find creative ways of bringing together traditional adversaries. And those creative ways, to be honest with you, oftentimes are quite different from the traditional approaches to conflict resolution. About 5% of what we do, at most, could be defined as mediation or negotiation in the traditional sense. We use media, we use arts and culture, we help local partners to establish, inter-ethnic bilingual kindergartens. We work in whatever way seem to have the highest leverage in local context to shift the overall dynamic of the conflict. And the last thing I'll say is that our emphasis is not so much to solve a specific dispute. Our emphasis is much more to shift the way communities view and deal with their differences more generally. So solving a specific dispute, when we try to help in doing that, is always done within a broader context. And if I can anticipate one point that might be on people's minds, we don't just do this abroad, we do this also in the United States, where we have a very adversarial way of dealing with our own conflicts, both internally and externally.
Darauf kommen wir zurück.
We'll be coming back to that later. Well, to my right, there is Franz Schüle. Franz Schüle, for the past 20 years and more, has been active in the Swiss Interchurch Aid, Switzerland, and for the last 6 years, Secretary General. Do you remember when this notion of civil society actually first began to emerge? Well, certainly longer ago than 20 years. But it has loomed larger more recently in connection with the whole dissolution of the bipolar world with the Helsinki process. I think those are the key notions there. Thank you very much. Franziska Müller, as a Middle East expert, she leads the NGO for women's empowerment. I think there's a Christian background to this, but not necessarily flying the Christian banner. She is a Middle East expert, and I wonder if there is a living civil society in the Middle East which we are overlooking. Answer, well, there's a very lively civil society there, which has been working since the end of the 60s with Israel, with NGOs in Israel and Palestine, and predominantly with women's organizations as part of the important civil society. The CFD is also active in Switzerland, as well as in dealing with Palestinians and Israelis, lobby organizations which work from the human rights standpoint, and for the past 2 years has been concentrating on Palestinian refugees and their future. The moderator, well, of course, we'll be coming back to that as well. And last but not least, Archbishop Ngana from Cape Town in South Africa. Your Grace, for a few years, you were a political prisoner imprisoned on Robben Island. Could I simply ask you to portray for us how that was?
Thank you very much. It looks as though my history goes ahead of me. Just to give a little background, there comes a time in the life of anybody where one has got to stand up for what one believes is right. In the 60s, as a young student, I got caught up in what is known as political activism. I am not a political animal. I am a person who stands for justice. So it so happens that as young people going to play soccer one afternoon, there happened to have been a politician speaking, addressing the ills of apartheid. And he was focusing on the past laws. And those of you who don't know what the past laws are, in shorthand, these were the laws in the apartheid era which determined, which was at the heart of the oppression of the black person, which determined where you lived, where you worked, where you would bury it, who you would marry. And so this was, in our view, very an abhorrent kind of system. And this particular politician had a focused campaign with time frames. And we got caught up as young people, forgot about soccer, got enlisted in political activism. And if you remember the marches, the first peaceful marches of the 60s, we were part of that. And of course, the long arm of the law caught up with us. And we saw ourselves being incarcerated on Robben Island. And Robben Island, as it stands, was built by our hands. My claim to fame is that I built the jail for Nelson Mandela because we were the first to go to Robben Island. And I just want to say one statement about Robben Island, that it was hell on earth, contrary to the pictures that we have today. It was, we were made to suffer, to regret what we stood for. The level of sadism was at its highest peak. And imagine a young man brought under apartheid to see white warders behave in the kind of way they behaved, because under apartheid we were made to believe that white people were close to being angels. And there we saw the reality of the other side of being human. And in spite of us experiencing that ugly scene, we have coined Robben Island the University of the World, where we had some basics on humanities, how you can see the ugly face of human beings. But be that as it may, we survived. I think we attribute that to the resilience of the human spirit and the fact that our cause was just. And of course, today, we are grateful for the outcomes that have come up there with Nelson Mandela's leadership, whom I call the apostle of reconciliation and the apostle of forgiveness. Maybe that's enough for now.
Erzbischof Ndungane.
I think the Archbishop embodies the fact that the civil society is always tends to get locked up and to be thrown in jail. Well, a proud humility is called for in a moderator because we all know where we stand and what the differences are between us. The Councillor Calmy-Rey has gone back into the audience. I don't know whether she was considering her position before she did that, but...
Ich möchte gleich anschließen.
Following on from the address we heard from the Federal Councillor, I'd like to say the following. She emphasized a series of political considerations, observation of elections, the participation of women, the crisis of lives, the extension of the agenda so that we're not only talking about the long-entrenched problems, but also the Geneva initiative. And I would like to make a start with that because we actually have a concrete and an important example here. Franziska Müller, how do you judge the Geneva initiative? I don't think you need to tell us about the attempt to go beyond the civil society or via the civil society in the Middle East to progress a peace plan which in every individual household in Israel as well as in the occupied territories that peace plan has actually been distributed, so far as I know, to every household. The Speaker, well, we've had a series of maps, accords, plans, and this latest initiative belongs in that series in the sense that it didn't arise from civil society. It has the advantage compared with previous plans and accords that in regard to a possible peace state, it describes a possible peace state that doesn't just contain the absence of conflict. The Geneva Initiative is it's a good paper, but it's a good discussion paper as we regard it. If it's to be regarded as a fait accompli, and if civil society comes along behind to support the point of women's potential, and if the civil society can be drawn into the process, then it is timely from the civil society standpoint. The moderator, what about the key role of women? How can that be supported on both sides? The answer, well, women are organizing in Palestine and in Israel to some extent also. They are organizing day-to-day projects. They are keeping the political discussion or the political argument going. They are projecting visions of peace for the future, and as they refer to everyday life. And they also include the gender factor in that. And these women's organizations are in a position to make their contribution to international negotiations, not least the UN Resolution 1325 rather, which was adopted by the Security Council in 2000. And that resolution calls for the involvement of women as equal participants in conflict prevention and peace processes. To give effect to this proposal, to this resolution, would require us to think not what role can the civil society play, but what role can governments play or the UN play when it comes to supporting the peace processes. In other words, we would turn the question around. One possible measure would be to work actively for the implementation of that resolution. Shamil Idriss, and the moderator resumes now. Shamil Idriss, you come from a country where this Geneva initiative has been received with benevolence, if not enthusiasm, and it has been presented to the White House. Do you have the feeling that this represents a really new initiative and that it could gradually unfold despite the great skepticism which it has met with among some both Israeli and Palestinian politicians?
I think it's an extraordinarily positive development. I think given what's happening right now, any initiative of this type should be welcomed. I think because of domestic American politics, especially in an election year, I think it's unlikely to see real American official leadership on this initiative or on any other serious peace proposal, which is really very unfortunate. At the same time, I have to tell you, I have very mixed feelings. At times, I feel the U.S. needs to be much more engaged in a forceful way, and at other times, I feel what's more likely to end the absolutely terrible conflict in the Middle East is a process similar to the Oslo Initiative, where really the U.S. was not very involved until hands were shaken on the White House lawn. And I don't know whether it would be better for the U.S. to be more forcefully involved or better for others, such as the Swiss and other governments, as is already being done, for instance, with the Geneva Accords, to be involved, and then for some American president one day to seal the deal with the power that the U.S. represents. So I think the initiative is extraordinarily valuable. Whether or not it represents something that will look like the final agreement, I just sadly don't have a lot of hope for American official leadership anytime in the next year on it.
Darf ich Frau Bundesrätin...
Could I ask the federal councillor how she imagines the scenario might be for the further development of this initiative? What would her best case scenario be, and what would her worst case scenario be? Perhaps it would be a good idea if you stood up so people can see you. Thank you for the question, says the speaker. We have lit a small light, so to speak. We've lit a candle with the Geneva Initiative. Now that candle burns, the light is on, and we must make sure that it continues to burn until governments find themselves in a position to behave right and to behave officially and make use of this initiative, or to use this text as a reference text. You're right. Maybe this isn't the definitive solution, but it does show that there are people who are prepared to negotiate on both sides and that there are practical solutions. So it's no longer possible for people to say there isn't anything. The second point is that the Geneva Initiative shows that in order to make peace, you must be ready for compromise. You must be ready to make compromises. I've already said that, but I would like to emphasize it again. It's very difficult to do this. The people who have negotiated this plan were very courageous because many of them have lost people in the conflict. Members of their family have perhaps been injured, and they know how intense the hatred is in a conflict, and they must go beyond that. And they have to say, now let's be sensible. We must compromise, and we must give something to the other side if we want to make peace. And that is extremely difficult to do. And the third thing is that for the first time, and this is why it's a new way. For the first time, the peace process is coming from bottom up and not the other way around. And that in itself is hopeful, because if we want a lasting peace, the people have to be convinced of this. And that is going to be our next step in supporting this initiative. And our next step is to broaden the dialogue. And that means that we must now work with the parties in Palestine and in Israel and to get this discussed widely by the entire population, to inform people so that they can discuss it and they can say what's on their minds, and so that they should know what it is they need to give up, what it is they need to renounce, but also what they would gain, what they would win if peace were to come. And that's an important contribution to peace. And so to answer your question, my hope is that this light will remain a light, will remain there until our governments are prepared to act. Thank you very much, says the moderator.
Erzbischof Nungane.
Archbishop, South Africans, in an exemplary act of reconciliation, have made peace that way. Can I ask whether the process which has taken place in South Africa, is that a model, or in part at least, could that serve as a model for Israel and Palestinians, as Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I think that the transition from apartheid to democracy is the greatest window of hope in resolving conflict. Many people, including some of ourselves, were predicting the worst-case scenario, that South Africa will come up in flames. But that did not happen. And instead is that the two formidable opposition figures, namely the ruling government, as it then was, the apartheid regime, and the African National Congress, its leadership in the liberation movement, in the greater interest and the greater good of the country, said, let's talk, and dialogue produced what we have in South Africa. And my view is that in any of the complex problems that we have in the world, which might come from time to time, there's nothing to beat dialogue. And in the dialogue, it's not a question of saying, I am right, you are wrong. It's a question of finding common ground. And I think that what's been mentioned by the minister, the question of sacrifice and the question of compromise is very important. And therefore, listening to one another, listening empathetically, and listening with our hearts is a way to resolve conflicts. I think the tendency is to talk at each other. And I think the spiraling of violence and counter-violence will not lead anywhere in the conflict in the Middle East. And the sense is what we came up with, or what was a result of the process of dialogue in South Africa, is a model that could be utilized. And of course, we came up with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's another story in terms of building on the process of reconciliation and nation building. Yes, I think that's a model that could be utilized and, of course, adapted to local conditions.
Darf ich nachfragen?
Could I ask you, Archbishop, a further question. What were the deeper reasons why the parties were willing to talk to each other in South Africa and not just against each other? Because that's very, very unusual. What were the underlying reasons why South Africa was so fortunate in this regard?
I think one key thing is leadership. I think to have got a person like Nelson Mandela, who against all odds could stand up and be prepared to say, we want to walk a new path. And I think leadership played a significant role. And to some degree, this was complemented by the leadership of the Nationalist Party as it then was. But I think that another underlying cause, from where I sit, is that the financial sanctions that had been put in place were biting. And I think that the whole morality of the apartheid had been undermined. And I think that is again where civil society, and in particular the churches, were very much upfront in that they produced a theology which undermined the authenticity of apartheid. And then you saw luminaries like Dr. Bears Naudé from a church which gave a theological underpinning to apartheid, saying, this is not so. And more of the Dutch Reformed theologians and leaders in the church came to that. And of course, there was the leadership of people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and people like Alan Busak, and the formulation of liberation theologies, which undermined the prevailing theology. And I think those factors, with the United Democratic Front, which was a broad-based civil society organizations, with all those demonstrations that were going on, I think to the ruling power, it became clear that they didn't have the moral authority of civil society to go on governing. And I think that from the from the liberation movement's side of things, they might have looked at the scenario and says, if you continued with fighting, anybody who wins will inherit a wasteland. And therefore, leadership, courageous leadership, together with a vibrant civil society which undermined the morality of apartheid, and activism that stood there, and common sense, really, and in the interest of the common good of society. And of course, there was the whole body of public opinion internationally, which under the United Nations had declared apartheid a crime against humanity. All those factors, I think, played in. But I think the key one is leadership. Leadership which was prepared to bite the bullet and say, this is the way, let's walk in it.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Nun sind wir in Davos.
Well, here we are in Davos, and we're meeting at this high school in the open forum, and in the margin of our meeting, there's another meeting taking place, the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum, and now I'd like to talk about the economy, or about business. Franz Schüle, the federal councillor, emphasized business, or the economy as well, in her discussion about civil society. What about the collaboration between civil society and business? What can it do to contribute? And what responsibility does business have, or does the economy have, for promoting peace? The answer, well, of course, it has that responsibility. Whether it knows that and actually exercises the responsibility is another matter. I would like to follow on from what the Archbishop was saying. back in the 60s, too, the boycott of South African goods got going. First of all, this was a kind of economic action in our own country and in various Western countries also. And it was not initially accepted or followed through on. But there was a group of civil society in Switzerland and in other countries too that started a discussion with business within the framework of this and very many other processes and so forth, and came to this conclusion that they condemned apartheid as a crime. So there was a recognition which derived from the logic. It wasn't a recognition that derived from the logic of business, but it was a long and painful process and the result of very lengthy grappling with the issues. And this, I think, is a lesson that we have to learn. Involving civil society in issues of peace, and that also includes justice, and in questions of reconciliation, involving civil society and those things, also means creating a certain discomfort. It may be uncomfortable, it may be burdensome, but I don't think that you can get through without that. So I'm not that optimistic, therefore, that business, the business world, always recognizes its own self-interest, that it has an interest in sustainable peace processes. I'm not just talking about arms dealing or about those business circles which sign contracts to promote oil extraction or diamond mining. That's more on the criminal side. It is civil society and business have to come to see that progress is possible and that recognitions can take place on both sides. There's an awful lot of work to do precisely with regard to peace processes and to get business on board as well. And if I could add a couple of sentences to this, I don't think we've got any business representatives here. At least we have representatives of the WEF. So would be interesting to hear something about the role of the WBF in many areas. There is a clear understanding that actions have to be monitored, and that can help the peace process. And this even applies to humanitarian efforts, because we know that a priori you can't assume that all peace furthering activities are necessarily going to be up to standard. And that is a subject for the WEF.
Ich hätte in Sachen
The moderator. I have a question to put to the federal councillor on the business issue. On the one hand, there are many expectations, many requirements placed on business, but on the other side, when there's a question of talking to other governments and emphasizing human rights and the importance of observance of human rights, then business begins to worry about its order book. And it doesn't want to see too much emphasis placed on human rights. For that reason, what could the Swiss foreign minister say about this tension between business fulfilling its duty and, on the other hand, its economic interests? Well, I have to say you surprised me a bit with this question, but. Or have I surprised you a bit? No, says the federal councillor. It's a proper question. It's a fair question, because there is a difference between long and short-term objectives. In the long term, I think business does indeed have an interest in peace prevailing in a country, because where people are living in conflict zones, they are poor. If they're poor, they don't consume, and that's not good for our export industries. And I always explain that to companies. And I say we have a common interest here in pursuing peace and supporting peace efforts. You need to do this together with us. And if you are in a country, then you need to work in that direction. And this is particularly true for companies which have long-term strategic objectives. And I think they're able to understand that. But sometimes it is true that as between long and short-term objectives, there is a difference, a discrepancy. And it's my role to clarify that we share a long-term interest in working in the right direction. And they have an interest in supporting us, not just in the peace process. That's the first step, but also to help us with development aid, with the humanitarian aid. But I can't guarantee that I have managed to convince everybody today. Thank you very much, says the moderator. Shamil, Idriss. Isn't there some danger of idealizing civil society and of embellishing it? If we look at the most recent conflicts or current conflicts, if we look back to the conflict in the Balkans, broad sectors of the civil society were actually fighting each other. Look at the massacres in Rwanda or Burundi. Let's look at what happens to the Indios in the Amazonian region of Brazil. Part of Brazilian civil society have actually taken part in oppressing them. So we have to look at that ambiguity.
Absolutely, you're right about the cases that you mentioned. At the same time, anything of great power can be used to destroy or to build. And civil society has great power. I'm actually very optimistic about the directions in which I see civil society contributing to peace building throughout the world. We have been, as an international organization, struck by the fact that if you go into any situation with a cynical attitude or without hope, and we get this all the time because we work in Liberia and in the Middle East, and we've worked in the Balkans, and people will tell you invariably, these people have been killing each other for years. The Middle East is the real one, and these people have been killing each other for thousands of years, is what you'll hear. And our experience time and again is if you go in with that attitude and with that cynicism, you will be blind to the hope that is all around you in every situation. If you go in with hope, not naive hope detached from reality, but if you go in with hope and looking for the rays of hope in any society, you will find everywhere, including in the civil societies everywhere, including even in the most brutal militaries, even in the most corrupt governments, you'll find a colonel, you'll find a minister, you'll find a leader of a human rights group, you'll find a leader of a women's movement. You will find people at all these different levels of society who are actually trying to operate in a constructive manner. Now, yes, they may be moving against the tide of much more destructive forces. Those destructive forces could be playing out at the government level, at the civil society level, at all levels. But what I would say, and I would say there are very few rules, I think, in this work, but what I would say is a rule, in my experience, is that everywhere, at every level of society, in almost any situation, you can find real rays of hope that with some support, engagement, and encouragement can really have an impact on their communities. And that's where I prefer to put my emphasis, which is not to ignore what you've said. The last thing I'll just mention is that in many of the cases that you mentioned, certainly Rwanda, civil society and populations are easily manipulated. This is particularly true in communities where education levels are low and where access to information is low. And take Rwanda as an example. When people need to rely on radio for their information, it's not just a means of entertainment, but it's the way you find out if you can get your crops to market. It's the way that you find out what's happening in the next town. Is there violence there? Is there not? When you have to rely on that as your sole real means of information, well, you can use that to divide populations very easily, and that was done very effectively in Rwanda. But what I encourage people to then think about is how powerful that same tool is and can be for the opposite purposes, to build communities together, to build reconciliation. And I would like to just mention that the Swiss Foreign Ministry in particular has been particularly supportive of that kind of work in not only sub-Saharan Africa, and to our organization as well, because we have established with local partners multi-ethnic teams that run radio studios. And I cannot tell you how powerful it is when you can get listenership of up to 90% of the population, not just listening to news programming, but everything from soap operas with a positive social message, to documentaries about people who have saved one another across the ethnic divides. All of these things are very powerful, and there's been real leadership from your government in that, and it deserves to be recognized.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Well, Franz Schüle wanted to make another brief comment on this subject. I quite agree that civil society is often part of the problem, and it must therefore also be part of the solution. And I think that is self-evident. I think it's of great importance that civil society itself should have some kind of control or some kind of monitoring. This could be the people, but particularly where there are ethnic constraints, that kind of control is missing. I'm thinking of international relations with various international organizations which could perhaps exercise that kind of monitoring. So I'm talking about international networking here. Church networks, for example, which in part are associated with certain interests. It would be good if there were international control or an international challenge brought to bear on the civil society structures. Thank you.
Franziska Müller, wenn Sie...
Franziska Müller. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you please turn off your mobile phones? We want to be communicative, but not telecommunicative. Franziska Müller. You are domiciled here in Switzerland. You have your organization here, which is called...
For Women's Empowerment. Ich weiß nicht, wie man das auf...
I don't know how we want to translate empowerment into German. Ermutigung, encouragement of women, emphasis to be placed on women, but that also has a political dimension. The moderator continues. Well, you're in this pretty much comfortable Swiss situation. If you want to have an influence on other countries and on people who are living in very different conditions, what about your credibility as a representative of Swiss civil society? Are you going to be taken seriously by your opposite numbers in other countries, or is it rather difficult? Could you be very practical in saying how, as the representative of civil society, how are you going to actually have an impact or an effect on others? Well, we don't seek it to be a one-way communication in which we have an impact on others. We work with partner organizations together, and they are too working on the concept of empowerment. They are elaborating drafts of women's peace policy. They are active. They are politically involved. And when we meet, if we meet, we meet in order to develop things further. Empowerment as being one example, as one of these buzzwords. It doesn't just mean improving women's situation so that individually they have a better time. It also means changing the structures so that in the civil society, too, for the benefit of women. And we work to exchange information, and we try to elaborate common foundations or common bases. This also concerns issues of financing. And naturally, that is unidirectional. Funding goes from us to them. But that funding is also supported by the church communities, by private donations. That's clear, but it has to be made transparently clear that it is we who are financing projects. That doesn't justify us sending our own experts there or prescribing anything to the people concerned. Everything has to be developed in context. So notions like empowerment have to be elaborated on the ground by women in Kosovo or wherever. And that's true also of Palestine. But I'd like to say that civil society isn't good in and of itself. Civil society, there are exclusive actors, there are actors or players in civil society that tend to be exclusive. And also the question is for governments, what kind of civil society do you want to work with? Civil society which is inclusive and which can be an overarch various different interests. Of course, that's extraordinarily attractive. It doesn't always work. The moderator, Archbishop, what is the role of South African? What has the role of South African women been, and have they played a key role?
Definitely, there is a phrase which in my mother language says, "Watinta abafazi, watinta imbokodo." Now that means literally.
Ich wollte die Dolmetscher bitten.
Is there any
Sorry, I have to let you down on that one.
you touch women, you touch a granite stone. And women have been very much involved in the struggle for liberation. We have got heroes, heroines who stood out. And we have had women, for instance, who led a march to the Union buildings on the same pass laws that sent us to Robben Island, because they realized that it was an oppressive law to them. But on a much more practical note, I mentioned to you about that wonderful non-violent demonstration on the 21st of March that we took part earlier on in our lives. Men were all asked to march to the city of Cape Town. And of course, there are those other men who were lily-livered, who tried to hide under beds. And women were very much active, took broomsticks, and said to their men, "Get out. Other men are going out to town." But more seriously, I think that women have been in the forefront of the struggle, and also in terms of community development programs, funders, and indeed I support that. I would rather give my money to programs led by women than those led by men, because women tend to be much more progressive and much more result-orientated than men. That's a fact of life.
Ich sehe Männer, die applaudieren.
I can see men applauding too.
But in the new government of South Africa, you see that it's been a deliberate plan to have women in key positions of government. Some of us are praying and hoping that the next president will be a woman. But of course, it shames us in the church because we still haven't had, we have a woman bishop in our church. The church in England is going to be debating next month whether to have women as bishops, when we in fact have decided that, but we don't have one. Yes, women have taken a strong role, a leading role.
Frau Bundesrätin Calmy-Rey, Sie haben...
Federal Councillor, in your address, you emphasized that in your programs, that's to say the Federal Foreign Affairs Department, that you're going to be very powerfully emphasizing women's participation in the peace process. Do you have the experience that women have particular assets or particular advantages in this process? The answer, I believe in women. I come from a canton where women freed the state from the French, or freed the city from the French. L'Escalade. So I believe in them. But women are accustomed to settling disputes among members of their families, and they're naturally not for war but for life. And we need more women around the negotiating table. When you look, you never see any women at the negotiating table. We certainly have work to do in order to make that succeed. And we also support the women's movement. We support the NGOs who work with women. And in our programs, that gender politics really needs to be built into the programs, needs to be taken into account in fashioning the programs. And we're convinced that our programs will be more effective and will produce more results if we can do that. And we know that from our experience. And we're going to continue along that line. So, thank you. Thanks to women.
Also die Beteiligung der
Women's participation is also it also goes without saying they will be taking part in the Geneva initiative and the participation of civil society. But it's almost impossible for a civil society to function on a day-to-day basis. If you think of it in terms of a process whereby different interests are reconciled, and the difficulties of everyday life are so great, as we know from the situation in Palestine, that you have to create the framework in which such a discussion can take place as a first task. And there are instruments for doing that. The Fourth Geneva Convention, for example, in regard to war crimes, and where war crimes are penalized, there are mechanisms, there's machinery for implementing that. And in addition to international humanitarian law, there is also the human rights conventions. I think it's difficult for the Geneva Initiative to expect approval from the civil society and support from civil society if these rights, these international rights, are not properly recognized and enforced. Thank you very much. Moderator, Federal Councillor. Well, yes, we've started this dialogue in Israel and in Palestine too. And otherwise the Geneva Initiative wouldn't work. It was started by civil society and it continues. It will continue along the same lines. But it's not easy. It's not simple. You're right. The conditions are difficult. But the dialogue is beginning and the information needs to be conveyed to people. The information has got to be got out to people. And the opinion in favor of peace has to be alerted. It has to be encouraged, and that's only going to happen if the information is available and if information about the initiative is made available to everyone, and if people start talking about possible solutions. And this isn't easy. There are the parties. The parties themselves, on both sides, find it very difficult to do that on the Palestinian and the Israeli side. But the conditions are there. You can't. You got to start somewhere, notwithstanding the conditions. And we're counting on people. We're counting on the population that they will simply empower themselves through this. I think the worst thing in these matters is to look and say you can't do anything. And the Geneva Initiative is showing that you can do something, no matter how little it is, how small it is. But at least you can make a start and speak up and say, we want peace, there are solutions, let's speak for that. You were saying earlier, we must get a we must get a hearing. We must make sure that we are heard, and we must make sure we take part in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Nun haben Sie, meine Damen und
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now it's over to you, and I invite you to ask questions or to make comments, but please make them as brief as possible, and then we can have a whole series of questions. So would you please stand up and briefly introduce yourselves? Who would like to get the ball rolling? Somebody over there. Thomas Hofer, good afternoon. I think civil society is a good way to go, and I think the first possibility. But what I see in the open forum, in the main, is the political way, the way of politics. Perhaps it would have been more difficult for the federal councillor to say what she said if she were not a federal councillor. But what about the political responsibility? There have to be rules of the game. And the rules of the game are always dictated by politics. And politics needs to follow the rules of the game. But if politicians won't take the responsibility, then nothing can be done. What is the official policy of Switzerland then? That's the way we have to go. The moderator, before I call on the federal councillor, could I just say something about the word politics? Politics, if you look at its etymology, it means civil society. It means the politeia, the Greek city-state, the civil society. So if we proceed via the civil society, and let me just set aside my hat as moderator, if you start calling the civil society way as an unpolitical or apolitical, I would deny that. I would say it is essentially, quintessentially political, and it's the expectation. Really, what we want is that the civil society should remind politicians of this truth. But now I'd like to invite the federal councillor to answer. Here comes the microphone on its way back. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure that I understood the question, but my reply would be as follows. I, and indeed Switzerland, has assumed the responsibility in regard to the Geneva Initiative. We've supported it financially and logistically. We haven't taken part in the substance because that was the business of civil society. The civil society got together and fashioned the substance of this initiative. But we have assumed a major responsibility. We have lent support, and internationally now I'm going all over the place, and I'm saying join us, join us. I'm saying that to other countries. Come with us, support the process. And I see no distinction, I make no distinction between what I think and what I do as a member of the government in this regard. Moderator, thank you very much. Franz Schüle. Just let me pick up on something that was said earlier. As concerns civil society in Palestine, Frau Müller said that we don't want to have an impact. We want to influence them or affect them. I wouldn't agree with that. We do want to have an effect or an impact. We want to challenge people in partner countries, of course, where we've got partners with whom we have some kind of association, like churches. Maybe it's a normal relationship. We want to take up the challenge, and that's a particular responsibility. And we have an exactly similar responsibility vis-à-vis our politicians, and we want to challenge them. And this was true also of business. We want to keep challenging them with specific issues. That can be our contribution. But politically, too, that is a political role which should be played by civil society. Thank you very much. Somebody else? Right at the front, and then after that, you. And if I have missed anybody, it's not at all because I am one-sided, but because I'm short-sighted.
Weck, and I come from Zimbabwe. I would like to really thank the Federal Councillor for talking about the issue of women not being on the discussion table. I hope you work towards having another Geneva initiative to have women on the table. But my question is to Idriss. What you talked very well about the manipulation of civil society by the powers that be it the opposition or the political or whoever is supporting them. What measures can be put in place to stop this manipulation? Thank you.
The manipulation I talked about specifically had to do with the lack of information and how easily, if you can get a hold of media resources, you can manipulate people. I think investment in education is the #1 thing to strengthen people or almost inoculate them against manipulation. I think the proliferation of media, responsible media, is very important. And when I say responsible media, I'm not talking, I think that I do put an emphasis on responsible. If you look at how most, in my country right now, in the United States, some of the most popular talk shows, discussion shows, I'll give you the names of 2 of them are Crossfire and Hardball. Okay? I mean, these are not titles that lend themselves to a nuanced understanding of anything or a deeper engagement of the issues. In the end, if you believe that we are all interdependent, if you believe that none of our issues are really solely the fault of one group at the expense of another, and I don't believe that that's the world. I believe that our problems are our global problems, and we have to work together on them. Then our media should address issues in that way. And I think one of the most effective ways of addressing this manipulation issue is with the media. Now, that begs the question, what about countries where the media is very controlled? Where, how are you going to get... And I have to tell you that again on this, that we found, if you go in with some hope and you're looking for the opportunities, almost in any situation you can find a way. Even in Liberia, before Charles Taylor left. Some of the most effective work done in Liberia while Taylor was there in terms of media was done by young cub reporters, 15, 16 years old, sometimes even younger. They ask questions of adults, including political leaders, that no adult journalist would get away with. If that's the venue you have to go through, try that. In other places in Burundi, the first really public engagement and discussion of the issue of ethnicity in the school system was through a cartoon book that a group of young men who had been involved in ethnic violence got together and produced to tell the story of what happens, how do you get involved in this violence? Who approaches you? What is unfortunately sometimes it was priests. What does your priest say? What does the university head say? What does the politician say? And what happens to you if you engage in that violence? They produced a cartoon book. It was eventually accepted by the Ministry of Education, which was a ray of hope in that country among the ministries, and now is used in all of the school systems. So what I'm saying is there may be international mechanisms. You may be asking about international law or UN conventions or things that could be done. What I'm interested in, or what we're most involved in, is not so much that side, as important as it is, but the on the ground, how do you actually do it? And I'll just finish with one thing. To get at your question, I think, there are 2 ways. In my view, there are at least 2 ways of making social change. One is adversarial, and one is non-adversarial. And people with the good causes can be either. My organization was founded by somebody who had a lot of success as an anti-war activist in Vietnam, and a lot of success writing an expose of the CIA that became a bestseller in the 70s. He founded this my organization out of a belief that while he was winning these battles, he was always fighting the same larger war. He was always picking the side of right and going to war against the side of wrong. I'm not interested in that. There are important ways in which adversarial advocacy can work, but that's not what I do. That's not what I'm committing my life to. That's not what my organization does. So what we will do is find the ways, the non-adversarial ways, of modeling what you intend to bring about. And if you're in such a closed society that all you can do for now is a cartoon book or a radio show with cub reporters, start there. You start wherever you can, and you expand the small cracks of light in any society. There are others who work at the level of adversarial advocacy, shaming the governments for not doing this or not doing that. And that's important, and I don't mean to demean that work, but it's not where I choose to spend my time. And so when you ask what measures can be put in place, the only answer that I know of is what can be done on the ground. And I have to really second what Madam Müller said. You only know that when you're on the ground, engaging with the local context. You can't direct it from afar. Because in one country it'll be radio, in another country it'll be theater, in another it'll be a cartoon book. It'll be different things. And so that's the level at which you have to engage, in my view.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you. Archbishop. On the question of manipulation in South Africa, did you want to say something else? Or did I perhaps misunderstand?
I would not say that there are not segments of civil society that are not manipulated, but in my experience, it's very difficult to do that. I think in the experience of South Africa, even under the most repressive regime, with all the television public broadcaster, we were not able to be manipulated, and instead it enabled the civil society to stiffen its spine. Even after our new democracy, in particular with the struggle with HIV and AIDS, we have seen civil society taking the government to task, even to courts, and we've managed to win in terms of the antiretrovirals. So that is the case even in your country, Zimbabwe. I happen to be involved in a low-scale mediation there. The civil society is as vibrant as anybody. So it's very difficult to manipulate civil society and to be successful. There may be some segments who are, but in the main, civil society do come up and stand up for what they believe is right.
Herzlichen Dank. Der Herr in roten.
Thank you. The gentleman in the red back there.
Dankeschön. Mein Name ist Alekan.
I've been intensively engaged with development cooperation for the past 12 years, particularly in southern Africa, southern countries like Africa. My question is, and really this is a question from development, like Mr. Schüle. Prevention is the most effective way of securing peace. Rather than waiting for conflicts to arise, prevention is the most important aspect. We've heard references to the arms dealing, arms trafficking, and if you really want peace, you have to have the courage to get rid of bank secrecy too. So my question is, in development cooperation, I've seen that family planning and AIDS prevention, for example, are a long-term human right which need to be ensured. For example, there's an overarching approach to AIDS which doesn't include family planning, even though it is a human right. And I would be glad if Mr. Schüle could say, yes, we do now take this seriously, and we are going to regard family planning as a human right, and not, as is the case today, to suggest that every pregnancy is unwanted. Mr. Schüle, first of all, I agree with you completely that one of our most important tasks is to be preventive, to take preventive action, and that also means a kind of early warning or early diagnosis of conflicts. I think it is precisely there that NGOs and networks and the civil society in general has a great strength, because they have the contacts through churches and grassroots organizations and communities on the ground, and it very quickly becomes clear where the real problems lie. My impression is that at least the second subject you mentioned, that's to say AIDS prevention, is also very strongly integrated into the programs. We're not just drilling wells in countries. We are addressing the particular problems of particular populations in particular places. Health and family planning, of course, belongs with that. But we don't travel around with family planning kits because, first of all, that's a concern of ours, but it must also be a concern of the population concerned for us to do that. Integrated approaches are required. Our projects need to work with the population in a given town, or in the country, in the village, and they will show which way we need to go. So that AIDS, family planning, and much else belongs to the challenges that we need perhaps to face. And I think that goes without saying. Thank you very much. Well, a very last question, because we are now coming towards the end of our discussion and we want to stop punctually. There was a gentleman over there who wanted to speak. Yes, it was you.
Darf ich Sie um eine kurze Frage?
Could I ask you to make your question brief? In the last decade, I've noted hundreds of Hercules aircraft flying over Switzerland, transport aircraft carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons and war material. They come from London, but originally they come from America, and it's conflicts and wars who knows where. In terms of prevention, I think it's enormous profits are made from this trade, this trafficking. Thousands of tons of material have been sent, which could be used in the poor countries. These Hercules aircraft have survived from the last World War, but are still being used. Thank you. And a few years ago, I sent a letter, and I had taken note of the registration of these aircraft. So it is proved. The moderator, well, that's not been taken note of. A very brief question. Somebody there?
Herr Stückelberger, Zentralsekretär Brot für alle. Ich möchte nochmals die Frage Friedensinitiative.
I'd like to bring up the question again about the need to monitor what's going on in connection with the question about business. It does seem to be a basic problem that we have to ask whether investments are tending to promote peace or not. Do investment normally goes where infrastructure is already present, where there are markets available to sell products, and it's not a reproach. That's absolutely normal. But the question is, this tends to promote conflict. Take the example of the Congo or of Indonesia, where surely the investments are a factor in strengthening the conflicts in other islands. You could also look at the example of Mexico and elsewhere. So what could civil society and politics as well help to direct investments, not where they would naturally go, but to direct them in certain areas?
Thank you, Mr. Stückelberger. I leave this question open. You made us aware of an issue that we cannot elaborate on at this time anymore. Mrs. Calmy-Rey, you introduced this debate with your presentation, your speech. Would you like to draw some conclusions at the very end, or not? Well, I would like to thank you for what you said. I am perhaps more than at the beginning of this conference convinced that all of us are involved in peace processes, civil society, governments, corporations, and we're not powerless. All of us can do something, although it may be a small thing at the beginning. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with an anecdote. It's not really a conclusion I'm drawing. We talked about the role of women. We talked about learning from each other. We took the example of South Africa as a role model for the Middle East, and we saw that the civil society can be part and parcel of the problem and therefore must be part and parcel of the solution. We addressed the role of the media, rightly so. They can have a positive or a negative effect. We talked about education. Now, for the anecdote. There are 3 small boys debating the difficult issue of how babies are born. There is a small French boy and a German boy and a Swiss boy. The French boy knows best and he says, "Papa et maman font un bébé." No, the German says, everybody knows that they are brought down from the heaven. And the Swiss says, no, it differs from canton to canton. And it's not only different from canton to canton, but from civil society to civil society. And we've been able to observe this, how different civil societies are. But there is one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that remains the same. Civil society may be viewed as a threat, as a challenge by many powerful people and oppressed by many, manipulated by many, whatever. But we in this hall know that civil society, first and foremost, is an opportunity and a force. Now, all of us who brought us together as a civil society, I would like to thank Mrs. Calmy-Rey, the speakers, the interpreters who made a considerable contribution, and the high school that is hosting this event, all the organizers, and Mr. Wipf, Mr. Stückelberger, who brought us here. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you who, on this Saturday afternoon, have come here to participate, to be committed, in order to take the language of the World Economic Forum, that is civil society at its best.